As everyone is well aware, humans have been fighting each other for about as long as we've existed. But while weapons have changed drastically over the years, from swords to guns to bombs, one strategy has stood the test of the years and has proven its effectiveness time and time again throughout history. Economic warfare. Waging a war on another nation's economy is one of the most effective ways to both end a war and to even prevent one from starting in the first place. So join us today as we explore the remarkable impact that economic warfare has had on world history and its quiet potential to cripple entire armies. While you might assume that economic warfare isn't generally deadly, there are several instances where its use was perhaps more lethal than any weapon could have been. Take, for instance, the Allied blockade of Germany in the First World War. The goal of the naval blockade was to mainly restrict the Central Powers from importing war material, which it did very well, forcing them to manufacture weapons and ammunition without much help from overseas. But the blockade had another impact, one so great that according to some historians, it was the true reason for the end of the war. Starvation. Before the war had started, Germany was producing about 80% of its own food from its agricultural sector, and so it wasn't expected that a naval blockade would have much impact on food supply. Even if it did, they could always begin importing food by land from Romania or Scandinavia. But as the war progressed, a few unforeseen factors came into play. First of all, nitrogen. Nitrogen is crucial in agriculture. It's a necessary element in the soil for plant growth. It's found naturally in the ground, but repeated farming of the same plot of land can deplete nitrogen levels faster than they can regenerate, leading to smaller yields or even total crop failure. Fortunately, just as the Great War was starting, a German scientist named Fritz Haber developed a process to pull nitrogen from the air and return it to the soil, a cheap, efficient method to manufacture artificial fertilizer, for which he eventually won a Nobel Prize in chemistry. So, Germany was pretty confident in their food security, but this dependence on nitrogen fertilizer eventually came back to bite them when Haber's factories were converted to use the nitrogen in bombs for the war effort. Without the fertilizer production, farms struggled to produce enough food for the hungry nation. Not to mention, even the farms that were still producing enough food suffered from a massive labor shortage due to all of the young men being sent to war. This situation wasn't helped by an unusually cold autumn in 1916, and by December, everyday staples like bread, potatoes, and dairy were so scarce that the general population was already resorting to wartime substitute foods such as powdered milk. But even this wasn't enough. The winter of 1916 to 1917 was so brutal that even these rations ran low, and the German public was forced to survive with a diet centered around Swedish turnips. This became known as the Turnip Winter, during which thousands of civilians died of starvation, malnutrition, and disease. There were riots, looted stores, and overall desperation. The following year, the German government announced that all men aged 16 to 70 now had to participate in mandatory employment aimed at strengthening the food sector and figuring out an effective rationing system. But by 1917, the goal was for each German citizen to consume just 1,000 calories a day. Immune systems were weak from the malnutrition, and so diseases like influenza spread like wildfire through the population. After the war was over, the official German statistics stated that 763,000 civilians had starved to death due to the Allied blockade. A similar situation also played out in another central power, the Ottoman Empire, where as many as 200,000 also died from starvation or malnutrition-related causes in the Great Famine of Lebanon. These food shortages were so extreme that many historians believe that they were one of the most important factors that led to the end of the war, having brought much of the public to an anti-war stance. But the First World War was far from the first time such tactics had been employed. For thousands of years, they had been used, dating back to the Crusades, even Alexander the Great, who used scorcher tactics. Destroying your enemy's crops has always been a surefire way to force them into submission. After all, it doesn't matter how well your soldiers can fight or how cutting-edge their equipment is. If their bellies are empty, they simply won't be able to fight for very long. The basic idea of a trade war is to deprive an enemy nation of certain war materials, ranging from mundane spare tank parts all the way through to enriched uranium. Now, in the modern era, this usually takes the form of international sanctions, wherein many nations collectively agree to refuse to do business with certain nations. And because the world's industry is so intertwined, sanctions often wield the power to cripple entire armies or without firing a single bullet. The perfect example of modern sanctions is the absolute mountain of them that were thrown on Russia after they invaded Ukraine in February 2022. Some sanctions had already been in place since 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, but the package that was put together in 2022 was of historic size. Putin, of course, was aware that more sanctions would be on the table after the invasion, but what he didn't foresee was how extensive they would be and the fact that more than 30 countries would join in on the sanctions, even including the notoriously neutral Switzerland. The overall goal of the sanctions was to 1. Hurt Russia's military capabilities, slowing them down on the battlefield, and 2. Sink their economy so badly that they lose the ability to even fund said war. Russian assets around the world were immediately frozen, leading to some angry oligarchs who now had to spend the summer without their multi-million-dollar mega yachts. But more relevant to the nation's wartime economy was the fact that all Russian companies capable of supplying the military were completely cut off from all imports. No spare parts, no components, no weapons, ammunition. You get the idea. Along with this, more nationwide sanctions completely prohibited the selling of key items in the tech industry, such as semiconductor technology, microchips, lasers, various types of sensors, etc. This also includes so-called choke point technologies. These are products that are only made by a handful of companies in Europe, North America, or Japan, such as super-specific alloys, complex machine parts, and advanced software. These items are important because there isn't really an alternative out there, so not even China can really step in to fill the gaps with some of these items. When all the sanctions hit, companies one after another withdrew from Russia, leaving gaping holes in nearly every industry across the nation. Even companies with products not under sanctions, such as food, made sure to announce their departure to avoid any PR scandals. By November 2022, analysis done at Yale University found that more than 1,000 companies have already left. Everything from airlines to fast food to car production. Visa and MasterCard stopped working in Russia, as did many functions at PayPal. As Russia's former Deputy Minister of Finance put it, it's as if Russia was stuck with a financial nuclear bomb. And the shockwaves from this bomb have already reached the battlefields. After using up much of their supply of cruise missiles on Ukrainian cities, some analysts say that Russia may only have a few hundred left and is finding it difficult to replenish their stockpiles without Western technology. Their aircraft are severely lacking in parts to properly repair and maintain good condition, which could be the reason that 10 of their jets have crashed into Russian cities while training in the first 7 months of the war. Tank production has also slowed to a crawl, and desperately needing more tanks on the front line, Russia has resorted to refurbishing 800 of its old Soviet-era T-62s that have been gathering dust for a few decades. Aside from hurting the military and tech production, the sanctions on Russia have some powerful side effects. One of these is known as brain drain, the mass exodus of educated minds from a nation. Tens of thousands of college-educated people have fled Russia since the sanctions hit, and even more fled when partial mobilization was announced. And it's not only the highly intelligent that are trying to get out. Many have already moved to places like Georgia and Kazakhstan, simply looking for work, having been left without any income when their foreign employer packed their bags and left overnight. As of this episode being written, the war hasn't yet reached a decisive end, but it's already evident that the sanctions have had a huge impact on the war, likely a crucial factor in Ukraine's continued defense. But sanctions and economic warfare in general aren't always one-sided. Russia is also retaliating in the economic sphere, using its two biggest exports, energy and food. Russia is the world's largest exporter of natural gas, having exported more than 200 billion cubic meters of it in 2021. The majority of this goes to the European Union. This has given Russia blackmail material over many of the countries sanctioning it, threatening to turn off their gas and let them freeze in the winter if they continue supporting Ukraine. Russia has already turned off the majority of natural gas exports to the EU, causing countries such as Germany to tell its citizens to prepare for a colder winter as they hurry to prepare alternate ways to heat their houses. Russia's other ace up its sleeve is agricultural blackmail. Ukraine is one of the world's largest grain exporters, accounting for 10% of the world's wheat and 15% of the world's corn, along with being the largest exporter of sunflower products. The war has understandably disrupted much of the nation's farming, made worse by the fact that Russia has seized many tons of already harvested Ukrainian grain and continues to block Ukrainian grain ships from leaving port. When the war began, nearly 20 million tons of grain were stuck in port. The issue here is that many countries rely quite heavily on Ukraine for their food. Top importers of Ukrainian wheat and corn include Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Yemen, countries that will have a difficult time switching food sources if Ukrainian grain stops arriving. And alongside Ukraine, Russia is also a top exporter, supplying many of the same countries with corn, wheat, and barley. In this way, Putin is essentially holding these countries hostage, perpetually poised to cause a global food catastrophe if things don't go his way. Ukraine has accused Russia of using the grain as blackmail, while the US uses the phrase weaponizing food, and several different attempts have been made to reach agreements on allowing the food to be exported, often brokered by Turkey. One of these was actually agreed to by both countries, but Russia pulled out just a short while later after the Black Sea Fleet was attacked in several drone strikes. After withdrawing from the agreement, the Kremlin said the Russian side cannot guarantee the safety of civilian dry cargo ships. Despite the threat, 12 Ukrainian ships left port full of grain on Halloween and made it out of the war zone without encountering any problems, carrying with them an estimated 350,000 tons of food. Following the shipments, in a bizarre twist, Russia changed their mind once again and re-entered the grain deal. Basically, the situation is pretty unpredictable at the time of this episode being written. And on top of the direct blackmail, the disruption to the food supply chains, as well as the energy prices in Europe, have contributed to the rising cost of living across much of the world, bringing out many people that are highly critical of the sanctions in the West. So, while the physical battle rages on between the armies in Ukraine, the economic battle rages on far beyond Ukraine's borders, playing out like a careful game of chess between world powers. While Russia has certainly made the word sanctions a term you hear all too often these days, they're far from the first to feel the pressure from them. Iran, after their first Islamist revolution in 1917, was also subject to crippling international sanctions. Just before the revolution, Iran had possessed the world's fifth largest army, but it was left out to rot by trade embargoes, which deprived them of spare parts, weapons, ammunition, engineers, pilot training, which all seriously hindered their war effort in the 1980s against Iraq, who, free of sanctions, was easily able to replenish their war supplies. Iran got so desperate that they even started to purchase arms from North Korea. And when we talk about sanctions, we're almost always talking about the Western world sanctioning a particular country of their choosing. But 1973 saw the US, UK, Japan, and other industrialized nations the target of sanctions themselves, placed on them by a coalition of Arab nations as protest for supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Oil prices skyrocketed as a result, but it failed to sever support for Israel. So for our last analysis today, we're going to take a look at the Second World War, which, thanks to it being the largest armed conflict in the history of humanity, saw the use of nearly every aspect of economic warfare. To start off, the Allies quickly blockaded Germany once again once war had been officially declared. After all, it worked the first time around, and perhaps a repeat of the turnip winter could get the German people to rise up against their mustachioed dictator. Unfortunately, it didn't work as well the second time around for a few reasons. First of all, by the time the blockade was getting around, Germany had already captured a lot of territory in Europe, expanding the places that it could harvest if push came to shove. Second, the Allies couldn't do much to stop land trade, and neutral countries continued selling to both sides, making their way to Axis powers through the Middle East, occupied regions of China, or their outposts in North Africa. Germany did attempt blockading the UK, though, trying to stop vital American supplies from keeping the island nation afloat during the Blitz. U-boats were deployed in a vast network around the Atlantic Ocean, and dozens of merchant ships were sunk by the sneaky submarines, depriving Britain of food, ammunition, or medical supplies, a sort of mash-up of both economic and traditional warfare. One of the most successful trade wars against Germany by the Allies was with Spain, who remained neutral in the war. Spain was a big exporter of tungsten, something Germany's war machine was in high demand for. Britain simply outbid Germany for nearly every single shipment of tungsten, causing the price to skyrocket. The Allies also launched an oil campaign against the Axis, which was a combination of economic measures and conventional bombing of German oil supplies. But the nation hit the hardest by economic warfare in World War II was the Empire of Japan. Western nations applied a complete embargo of oil, steel, and iron, even enforcing the blockade with submarines. This was a major problem for Japan, who doesn't have a whole lot of natural resources within their own territory, which was part of the reason for invading Chinese Manchuria and French Indochina in the first place. During the early years of the war, faced with being slowly squeezed out by the West, Japan invaded more nations in Southeast Asia and the South Pacific, taking over old Dutch oil infrastructure. But all this did was delay the inevitable. Japan failed to cripple the US Navy during the surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, and soon enough the American war machine was in full swing. Japan, still grasping for resources wherever it could, simply couldn't match the production and industry of the Allies. A crucial battle such as Midway or the Coral Sea, Japanese warships and aircraft carriers were sunk, airplanes were shot down, and ammunition stores were blown up. All things that the Empire struggled to replace in time. There just wasn't enough metal to go around. Meanwhile, American naval production was off the charts. Just imagine how shocked the Japanese were when they learned that the US had entire ships dedicated solely to ice cream production for its men overseas. Unable to recoup their losses with each decisive, destructive battle, by 1945 nearly the entire Imperial Navy was sitting at the bottom of the ocean, and Japan had no hope of building enough warships in time in order to face the full wrath of both the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, we all know the cliché saying that the Second World War was won with British intelligence, American steel, and Soviet blood, but at the end of the day, the various forms of economic warfare waged by the Allies are what really allowed these three factors to be quite so effective.